Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Faruk Rahmanovich and I am joined today by Brother Kareem.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
In this series, we're doing a chapter-by-chapter exploration of Sayyid Hussein Nasr's book, A Young Muslim's Guide to the West. We'll be focusing on one portion of a chapter in these sessions and delving more deeply into ideas within the passage, like what implications can you draw, what conclusions can you come to, and showing you how to read these kinds of complex texts more closely. In today's sessions, we'll be looking at Chapter 12, Modern Education, its history, theory, and philosophies. So, what caught your attention on this one?
Well, let's take a look at the first page of the chapter, page 209. This is a relatively short chapter compared to the rest of them, but that doesn't make it any less important here. And we can see that from the very first sentence of what Nasr says in the first paragraph. He says, "For the great majority of young Muslims who come to the West, the Western institution most often encounter, and the one with which they have the most intimate experience, is the educational one. This is also true to some extent of young Muslims who are studying in the modernized educational institutions within the Islamic world itself, institutions which are modeled upon Western ones and have been created since the 13th/19th century in different countries of the Islamic world with the express aim of introducing modern learning to Muslims. It is, therefore, important to have a deeper understanding of the role and meaning of education and educational institutions in the modern West, and also the historical roots of Western education." Alright, so the first sentence stood out to me because I can actually relate to it quite a bit. Not me personally, obviously I was born here, but a lot of my friends came here for education, often as teenagers. Right? For 2 years I attended an almost 100% Islamic school. It's almost 100% Muslims. Vast majority of them, I would say 90% South Asian, right? Desi students. And of those, yeah, a lot, while some of them were born here, for a lot of them, they came here at some point for education. Some of my best friends from my time there came here sometime between about 8th and 10th grade, and in many cases without their parents. It's not like the whole family came here. Just the parents basically sent their kids from India or Pakistan here, where they had family. You know, perhaps an uncle or a cousin lived here, and that uncle or cousin would basically take care of the child while they were going to school here. Later on, the parents would come here, maybe 2 years, 4, 6 years later on, but the kids were basically sent in advance to start their education here, with the eventual goal that they were going to enter into an American university. They were going to get educated in a field like medicine, especially, although also possibly engineering or IT were options as well. Although really it's like 80 to 90% medicine, realistically. And the degree from an American university, especially from an American medical school, is so much more valuable than one from India. One of my friends actually, like, his dad was a surgeon in India, and when he came here, he really couldn't get anything better than being like a medical assistant, because of just the difference in how much the degrees are valued. So, yeah, while there are a lot of kids who are born here, a lot of Muslim kids, and, you know, a lot of them are even native to here, you know, a lot of black Muslims, a lot of white Muslims, a lot of second or even third generation immigrants, there are a lot of Muslims who are being sent here for that express purpose. And so, when they're sent here, they don't necessarily know what it's going to be like here, and that causes a pretty big problem, right? I mean, if you're sent to an all-Islamic school, you're expecting that there's going to be some Islamic education behind it. But what if they're being sent to like a public school instead? They're entering into a system that they don't really have any familiarity with values and a culture that, I mean, some of it has infiltrated into their societies as well, but it's certainly being implemented in a different way. And the values that are taught in our school systems are so different from what you would think of as traditional Islamic values. And this is something that is pervasive. It's throughout the educational system to such an extent that you don't even think about it being there. You don't even realize that you're being taught things like the sovereignty of the individual. You don't even realize that you're being taught things like secularization, criticism of religion, nationalism, these kind of ideas. And while some of them, like nationalism, I'm sure is still taught, say in India or in an Arab country, for example, concepts like the amassing of wealth for the purpose of wealth, or a more modern critique that you'll see even a lot of Westerners give of our education system, which is that it's basically designed just to build the next generation of drones, office drones. I mean, not the flying drones that Amazon now uses to deliver your packages.
That's engineering, by the way.
Yeah, it's engineering, yeah. But that's a modern critique that we see a lot of here. There's numerous, movies like, say, Office Space, for example, that are based around that very concept. So while there are a lot of Western critiques, those still are within a Western framework, and they don't provide that much value for us as Muslims, because they're not helping us get closer to what a proper Islamic education would look like.
I think the only places I've seen people really meaningfully talk about proper Islamic education is people like Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, who's rather obviously studied what that education used to entail, and to some extent he's attempting to emulate that concept within the framework of American education through his Zaytuna Institute, which is an accredited college. So that's about the only place I've seen it. Other places seem to have this idea of like, we don't spend enough time nodding our heads and memorizing Quran, and it's like, yeah, but no. Yes, it's sort of important, but like, if you don't follow that up with the other parts, it used to be together with this idea of memorization, like understanding of the language, and then the studying of tafsir, so that you can actually understand what it is that you've memorized. I mean, they might as well be just memorizing songs in Chinese, for all on the assumption that they don't speak Chinese, right?
Sure.
Yeah, it's just like foreign sounds. Yeah, it's not actually a topic that gets a lot of attention, and maybe it is precisely because it's sort of seen that a degree from an American institution is the thing that's valued, and therefore it is the American institution with everything that it has going on which is the right way to educate, as opposed to whatever it is that you have in India, Pakistan, or wherever you're from if you're coming over here for education. So that's I don't think this gets a lot of consideration, specifically because there is a starting premise that the American educational system is somehow superior, and so people swallow it hook, line, and sinker without sort of thinking of the inherent, let's say, anti-religious bent, materialistic bent.
The reasoning behind that seems to be, if the end goal is good, then the process to get there must have been good as well. Or at the very least, don't question the process to get there,
right, if
the end goal is good.
The end justifies the means. And yeah, so that's it's sort of an interesting problem, but I don't think it's just an issue for people that are coming in from the outside. I think it's also a problem for for a lot of kids, and not just Muslim kids either, on the inside, right? Like if you go to an Islamic school, all like K through 12, and then you enter the university, you're still left with this massive shock.
Mm-hmm.
Because in that case, it's not so much the materials that you're being taught, but it seems more like the environment in which you are located is no longer one that takes as a starting axiomatic assumption, Islam is true, and then you move on. Same thing with students that grow up in an all-Catholic school environment, or if you go to all Jewish schools, or all, fill in the blank of some sort of a segment of the population. Right? If you go to those kinds of schools and those are the kinds of people that you primarily associate with, then when you are forced to step out of that as you enter the university, you're going to have the same sort of shock moment that a lot of these kids that come in from abroad are faced with as well.
Yeah, and
maybe
even
not
if you
to
don't
the
get
same extent.
Even if you don't get it at the university level, you get it later on at the level of the working world, right? So where we live, we're not that far from Wheaton, and there's something there that the kids call the Wheaton bubble. And this is, you've got Wheaton Elementary, I forget exactly what it's called, Wheaton Grammar School, you've got Wheaton Academy, and then you've got Wheaton College. And for those of you who may not know, Wheaton College is one of the, if not the most premier Christian, Protestant universities in the country. And at least in terms of academic rigor, yeah, it's pretty good, but it's also premier because of its emphasis on Christianity. I remember when I was, first looking at colleges way back in the day, they sent me a mailer like all the colleges do, and I mean, on the first page, there's like 5 or 6 references to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ right there at the beginning. So you get the impression right away, this is a completely different kind of place. But the kids there still call it like the bubble, right? In the sense that, yeah, I mean, eventually you have to leave it at some point.
No, I have to say that's still a rarity in the U.S. that you actually have a religiously oriented university. Both of us went to Benedictine University, and you'd think like, okay, I mean, it's a Jesuit,
obviously Catholic
university,
yeah.
Right? Like that should, but like no, right? Like there is, if we just covered up the sort of external little signs of, like whatever, there's a couple of crosses here and there, you couldn't tell the difference between that and like University of South Florida, which is a state university with no affiliation. So it's there is very little of that what Nasr is going to call the traditional kind of educational system. In fact, at the same page 209, just a little bit down, he says, education was related to religion, and the educational institutions were either directly or indirectly controlled by the church. This is in reference to the what he would consider the pre-medieval, pre-modern
the West
period.
Renaissance.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's, I mean, it's not really a common thing to see. So you're almost guaranteed by going to a college in America that you're going to be exposed to this sort of, let's say, anti-traditional educational approach. So that's it's one of those things that I think it bears noting that, like, look, you have to, whether you're in the West or not, right? You have to confront the fact that there is a particular way in which the West, which is a dominant cultural force on the planet, the way that it is and what it's based on and what it is selling you, and the way that it's ultimately sort of going to impact what's going on. And you have to understand what it is and how it works and why it works that way and what it brings that seems to be a positive and what are the negatives and all the rest of that. And you have to do that. I think you have to deal with that early on, because this idea, and it is present in a lot of immigrant communities, of like, oh, like we'll sort of shelter our kids from that by having them go to schools where it's essentially just them. Like, it doesn't do your kid any favors. Not sort of in the way that is being anticipated. Like, oh, they won't be exposed to I'm using air quotes here, the Americans, the non-Muslim Americans. They won't be exposed to it. It's like, dude, you live here. You are inherently exposed to it. The only sort of difference is, have you learned how to deal with it? And I feel like that the less exposure to it you have, the sort of worse off you are. The bigger the shock is going to be when you no longer have your parents holding your hand, going to a very exclusive, sort of segregated kind of an institution. So when these kids walk into college, it's a massive shock, and all of a sudden they're exposed to all of the sort of Western materialistic, secular, anti-religious ideas all at once. And I think that's actually a pretty negative experience, because if you haven't been taught how to deal with that, and odds are you haven't, you're not sort of eased into it. You're thrown into the deep end with a pretty heavy weight around your ankles. Your odds of sinking in that environment are pretty damn high.
Right, so the idea of, I will send my kids to an Islamic school in order to avoid these problems, is a failure if that's all that you do. And that's the real problem. And I don't know if we've discussed it before in one of our previous episodes, or if it's just something we've talked about in the class, but I know we've discussed this issue before, more specifically regarding just sending your kids to Sunday school and feeling like you've done your job at that point. But the problem is more believing that it's almost like outsourcing responsibility to the schools for taking care of this issue. Right? The school will know exactly what to do. Well, yes, your kids spend a lot of time at school, but they also spend a lot of time doing other things too. They watch TV, they play video games, they're on social media, they watch movies, and unless you're keeping them in those schools all the time and they're not doing any other extracurriculars or anything outside, they probably also have non-Muslim friends too. So they're going to get these influences. And if you're not doing something, and doing something intentionally to counteract that, and you're not doing it in such a way as to be preventative, then yeah, it can actually be worse. And what I mean by preventative there is, you can be reactive. The kid comes home and they're wearing something they're not supposed to wear, or something like that, and it's just yelling and like, no, we don't do this, haram, haram, that kind of thing, right? That's being reactive.
Yeah, that always works, right?
Yeah, right. But if you're handling it in what I'm calling a preventative kind of way, which means you're discussing these issues with your children beforehand. You're raising with them what kinds of issues they're going to run into, what we as Muslims believe about certain things in advance, before they even encounter those things in school, in college, in the working world. Then, assuming you're doing a good job of it, you're equipping them with the tools for them to be functional, critically thinking Muslims when they are out on their own.
I don't know, it seems like so much of this is just so... it's so short-sighted and blind. Right? Ultimately,
sort of lacking any sort of meaningful coherence. What you have is and I don't know, a lot of that actually seems to be an immigrant thing, because I've certainly seen that with Bosnians who weren't religious in any meaningful way, right? But but the Bosnian culture, right? Like that sales pitch, and in this idea of you're somehow going to be here because there's something that's valuable about this place, but you want to stay exactly as you were over there, whatever there is, right? It never works, and so that's where that like reactiveness really sort of seems to kick in, because there is no other way to deal with it if you haven't actually taken the time to understand the place that you're in, to learn about it, to understand its history and how it progressed, and then to teach that to your kids. All you really have is going like, we don't do that, but your kid, I think, is fully within their rights to go like, well, why not? We're here, aren't we? Right? Especially if you brought them here, and they get to go like, well, what'd you bring me here for? Right? And I think that this is sort of the big point that Nasr is pursuing. It's always this idea of like, you need to understand what is going on in order to meaningfully be able to engage with it. So the part of the problem of that Sunday school stuff, right? Like, yes, it's who do your kids see, but your kids see you more than you sort of anticipate. So if the only time they learn about religious anything is at Sunday school, and they learn like, okay, Muslims do this, then they come home, you're not doing it, you are giving them the counter argument for behaving the way that they learned in Sunday school, right? But there it is again. It's that outsourcing. Like, oh, they'll teach them. It's like, no, you have to be teaching them. Whether or not you have somebody who officially holds classes and whatnot, you are the sort of practical teacher for what these kids understand to actually be important. Because if, whatever, at Sunday school you learn about zakat being important, and then they come home and parents don't have the concept of zakat, and like they're trying to sort of cheat at it, what do you think they're going to take away from that? Right? So yes, you can outsource the official, like, oh, here's the official teacher, but you can't outsource the implementation, the thing that the kids will really take away from it. So if you tell your kids that yes, religion is very important, it's very important, but the only thing that you seem to care about is how well they're doing in the materialistic sense and how well they're doing in getting into med school sense, then guess what matters? Right? That they can learn that part very, very quickly. That's the only part that matters, and so all the rest of this other stuff just sort of falls away, as it's the kind of thing you pay some lip service to, but you don't actually do anything about.
Sure. When you talk about practical teaching, it's the idea of modeling good behavior.
Yes.
Right? So, children, especially young children, but it doesn't ever really go away, right? Children are sponges, right? They will notice what you do and what you don't do. And so, a mutual friend of ours gives the example of Six Flags Great America having an all-Muslim day where, like, this will be the one day where Muslims can all go there, right? And then the parents are telling the 13-year-old to tell them that you're 12 so that you can get the discounted rate. And so what does the kid learn from that? Well, mom and dad will lie for $20, and they won't forget that.
Yeah.
Yeah. At the same time, it's not meant as a rebuttal to it, but I think it's an important thing to remember also. And I guess this applies more to people who have run into this problem before. One idea that I encountered one time in one of Dr. Jordan Peterson's lectures is that one of the most critical parts of maturing is learning to forgive your parents for being human. The idea there being they're going to mess up sometimes. So if you're expecting perfection, and a child, looks at their parents as the exemplar, right? The one who's going to teach them what is virtuous. And so any failure then can become like a betrayal, right? And so many of our psychoses that exist in this society are the results of those kinds of things, right? Daddy wasn't there to give me a hug kind of thing, right? At some point, you also have to remember, though, that your parents are still humans, just like you, right? You're going to have children one day, and you recognize that you're going to make mistakes, too. And so, just as I'm sure you hope that your children are going to forgive you for the mistakes that you make, you have to be able to forgive your parents for the mistakes that they made. Now, like I said, I don't intend that as a rebuttal, more as something to add on to the point, because there's a difference between occasionally messing up because you're human and regularly modeling, in this case, un-Islamic behavior, or you could say more generally just immoral behavior.
Yeah, no, I'll agree with that. That's mistakes are one thing, but the sort of concerted effort with clear intent going in the wrong direction is sort of the problem.
And I think people can generally tell the difference.
Yeah, but I think as that mutual friend of ours sort of notes, that is sort of what's happening. It's not a one-off.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And this is really important in terms of not particular actions, but the sort of principles that you're actually beholden to, right? So, like, it's $20, who cares, right?
Right, because those principles are ultimately what you're actually teaching.
Yeah, so if you betrayed, and that's the way the kids want to see it, if you betrayed a core principle for $20, then it's not the principle that's actually primary, it's the $20 that's primary. Money overrides religious rules. And we can certainly see plenty of that. And it's not just in the Muslim community, pick a community, right? Whether it's people getting board seats because they donated money, or people being held in higher esteem because they make more money, or because of the kind of car they drive, or right, like if these are the things that are regularly modeled, then that is exactly what the kid's going to learn, right? It's sort of that Machiavellian line, right? It's not important that your ruler is religious, it's important that they appear religious. Well, you've got to make sure you show up for Jummah and whatnot, but really what matters is how much money you make. And as soon as you have that sort of thought process, you have displaced what Nasr will call the proper order of things, right? No longer is money and the sort of materialistic ideas, no longer are they subservient to this overall goal, which is Islam. Now they have displaced it, and now that's the important thing. And you are as Muslim as the materialism will allow you. So it's in order to help sort of mitigate that shock, I really do think that it's critical. And again, this isn't just for Muslims, this is for pick a minority group, or like any sort of group that ends up becoming sort of isolated from general population because their values don't necessarily match the values of the society at large, right? It's really important to get exposure to that and to be educated and to understand both what that society at large is, but also why your values are this different thing and why that matters, and then to be able to understand it and also see it modeled to some extent, so that you sort of start off in the kiddie pool, and then you kind of work your way into the deep end to the part where you're sort of on your own and sort of submerged in that larger dominant society if you're going to be able to maintain what you are coherently, right, without having to have a split personality about it, right? Like I'm a materialist, secularist at work, and then I'm Muslim after hours, kind of thing, right? Because that's not mentally healthy to begin with.
Yeah. All right. To put your example in educational terms, since this chapter is about education, an example that comes to my mind would be if your parents get more angry at you for getting a B than for missing Jummah, what lesson are you going to take away from that?
Yeah, so there you go.
Right.
Really
Grades are more important. And then, of course, the question is, well, why are grades important? Because generally people don't just be like, grades are important for the sake of grades, right? Grades are important because you're not going to get into a good school without it, and then you're not going to get into a good medical school, and then you're not going to get into a good profession and get a good job as a prestigious doctor. And if you're not a prestigious doctor, then you're not going to get married, or your marriage prospects dwindle greatly, and that then becomes the ultimate goal. It becomes an issue of status, really, more than it becomes about money. Because if the goal was to make money exclusively, they'd send their kids into finance.
Well, that's
a great place to go.
That's increasingly on the rise. So that there may be something to be said for that.
Well, yeah, I'm actually not too familiar with that. On the issue of finance in Islam, I think it would be outstanding if we had more institutions that were dedicated to Islamic finance. But that would be if they were actually dedicated to Islamic finance, like Sharia compliant mortgages and such, as opposed to just going into finance and now working for some company at Wall Street.
Yeah. Or there's now lots of fields that get co-opted by finance, right? So statistical modeling, all these. I mean, you're going into it and you're like, it's math. It's like, yeah, but you know what you're going to use it for.
Yeah.
Right. You know exactly the job that you're aiming for, and that job is Merrill Lynch consultant for futures trading, and
yeah.
You're right. So there is. Let me see if this is the line here. All right. Yeah. So on page 211. It's the second start of a paragraph. It says, as far as the goals achieved by the educational system established by various European states and later on in America are concerned, these have consisted of the propagation of national ideals and philosophies such as the new secularism, nationalism, utilitarianism, public welfare, and have included, of course, economic goals spurred by the idea of material progress, which in the 13th, 19th century became almost a religion on its own. The concept of education in the classical sense of training the mind and the soul has not disappeared, especially in older educational institutions and church-sponsored schools, and wherever liberal arts education flourishes. But it has been seriously challenged by the new educational philosophy.
That last sentence there, I highlighted that one as well. I thought that was a really important one.
So to sort of take it from the top on this one, I think this sort of builds in that idea of, we've been talking about this for a very long time now, of the purpose of things, right? The hierarchy of values that every society has to have in order to be a society, because that tells you where you're going to devote resources and focus and all the rest of that. And by default, the educational institutions of a society are going to reflect the values of that society. And as they attempt to teach the kinds of things that are valuable in that society, or that are considered valuable, what they will have to do is they will have to anchor it on the same basis as the society itself, right? Because why is this important? Why is this the thing that we're spending time on, right? So as you learn about fill in the blank, you have to understand its importance through the lens of the sort of social observation of why that ought to be important, and therefore we have it as a thing that you study. So you can't learn material sciences in the West without being sort of indoctrinated, or at least exposed to the indoctrination of the materialistic idea that everything that is real must be quantifiable. Because if you didn't have that as your starting basis, then this would be one of sciences, right, on equal footing with others. But as Nasr has pointed out in the previous chapters, that's more or less not been the case since the 16th century, a little bit prior. So the attitudes that come with this sort of standard Western education are all the sorts of things that are otherwise problematic from an Islamic perspective. So whether it's secularism, which is taken as a quote neutral starting point in education, or nationalism, which granted you'll find that everywhere you go. Utilitarianism is, I mean, it's an ethical theory that gets pushed really, really hard without the people even knowing that that's what they're pushing, right? And it would just say stuff like, well, it just makes sense that, fill in the utilitarian line. And if we want to be serious about where that takes us, and this is a big chunk of my ethics classes, when you start unpacking what that means, suddenly students like recoil in horror as they get to see like what exactly that set of statements actually means. And they're like, well, not that. It's like, well, how is it that all of you thought that this was the right thing to do when we started the semester? Right? It's not an accident, because I have students that are from Southeast Asia, and they are Pakistani, and they are Indian, and they are Bengali, and they are Chinese, and they are sort of the white American, and they are the black American. Like, they're all there. It's such a crazy mix of people, and they all have the same idea at the start of the semester. You go like, that's not an accident. That's something you've been taught. So it's definitely built in, but like utilitarianism is the antithesis of Islamic ethics. It has to be, right? Because it says that there is no such thing as rights. There is no such thing as sort of objective values. There's only like whatever makes people the happiest. To sort of put it in terms that people might have heard before, that it's Spock's line from the original Star Trek, right? The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. So it's okay to do essentially whatever, so long as it is maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering.
Right. To give an example, right? We're dealing with COVID-19 right now. What if I told you that I could come up with a cure for it, but in order to do this, I would have to kill 1,000 babies? Now, I imagine your students would, as you said before, recoil in horror at the idea of me killing 1,000 babies in order to come up with this cure. But if you're following a strictly utilitarian view of what to do, I mean, the potential number of lives saved could be in the millions if we did that.
You would need another bit there, which would be something like, if you don't do it your way, the time to discovery is going to be an additional whatever, like say a year, at which point you have 2 million additional deaths that you otherwise could have prevented if you just sacrifice 1,000 now to speed up the development process. So yeah.
And yet the issue is, can they really even articulate why they feel like that's wrong?
Well, they can't, and that's actually the very interesting thing, because they keep talking about, the right thing to do, and you go like, well, according to what? Because according to utilitarianism, the only right thing to do is whatever is going to best maximize happiness and minimize suffering of the largest number of people on the planet. So there is no right thing to do in the sense of universally always right. And they don't sort of catch that. They still keep going off of this idea that there is some sort of a universal right and wrong, even though what comes out of their mouth is purely utilitarian. So it's a really interesting problem. I think actually it's that feeling of there is right and wrong, which is probably responsible for quite a bit of the success of like the Marvel comic universe and things like that. Because as you look at those stories, they're all about essentially prophetic figures,
Sure.
right? Batman has never beat up the wrong person for stealing a purse, right? Ever, right? So you have this some sort of infallible knowledge that is bestowed upon these characters, and they're always these morally upright sorts of things. By the way, obviously not always, but if we talk about the sort of standard kinds of heroes, that's the sales pitch. We're not talking about the was it Punisher or Spawn or those sorts of
like the Watchmen.
Yeah. So there is no, but even like when you find characters like that essentially just sort of are willing to destroy everything, even that actually reads as prophetic, sort of Old Testament kinds of figures, right? It's just that's a different set of prophetic figures. You have a set of prophetic figures that shows up and they talk to people, and then you have the sort of wrath of God obliterate a civilization sort of prophetic figure. And these have actually sort of shown up in waves, which I think tells you something about how we perceive society. This latest wave sort of understands the government of society to be mostly inept, not corrupt, inept. And if you want a really good visual of that, you can watch, I think it's a very opening of Iron Man 2. He's giving testimony in Congress, and essentially the U.S. Congress wants to take away the Iron Man suit from Tony Stark because it should be a national defense thing and it shouldn't be in the hands of one person, and so that they're telling him how they are the more capable ones to use it. And Robert Downey Jr. playing Tony Stark sort of stands up and hits two buttons and like hacks everything in the room, and takes it over, and then just sort of walks out as the government is left floundering, right? And so what he does is he demonstrates the pure incompetence of government in a single stroke, and so if you contrast that to like earlier superheroes like whatever Batman, Spider-Man, that sort of era, what you have is the idea of highly corrupt government, right?
Or in the case of Spider-Man, corrupt media.
Well, and the government, because otherwise you wouldn't have, like, the police would be doing their job, right? You wouldn't need some teenager in a costume running around preventing crime, because it would be sort of prevented by default. But you get to I mean, in Batman, there's precisely one honest cop, right? And that, by the way, is the reason those superheroes wear masks, because the justice system, I mean, what ought to be that the governance system of society has been so eroded that to fight evil you have to hide, because evil has penetrated into everywhere in society. So to be a good person, you actually have to hide who you are, because you are inherently stepping on those of people in very powerful positions. So in order to avoid sort of blowback, you have to hide who you are in order to go help people. But anywho,
yeah, to bring this back to education,
yes.
I think one really important thing to remember is that one of the primary functions of education is the transmission of a society's values to the next generation, right? And if you look at it in those terms, you realize that the Western educational system inherently must be transmitting its values to your children. And at that point, you're basically just sticking your head in the sand if you think that your kids can go to a Western school, or even an Islamic school that's, at least to some extent westernized, and expecting them not to have those values transmitted to them.
Well,
and
I don't know about transmitted, but at least exposing them to them.
Sure. One of the things that Nasr starts with, if we go all the way back to the opening paragraphs of this, is that it was standard, at least in Europe, before the Renaissance and throughout the Islamic world, that schools were transmitting religious values, right? Well, if we're in a world where schools aren't transmitting religious values anymore, they, in essence, become the new church of that particular place, right? So he says that, let's see if we can find the line here. Right, if you keep going down that same paragraph that you were reading from there, consequently, the universities especially, and through their influence, secondary and primary schools, have become on the one hand a kind of secular church for the spread of secular ideas, and the professors and teachers have come to occupy to some extent the role of the earlier priesthood, wielding definite authority in their fields, especially in the field of the sciences. So, we've talked about this idea before regarding a few other institutions. We've talked about Americans worshiping money, we've talked about them worshiping entertainment, sports, and so on, and the parallels that you can see, right, like the sports stadium as the cathedral, or the arena as the same kind of thing there. But it's true about schools as well. The idea here is that this is the place where values are being transmitted. The role of religion in society has eroded to such an extent that now secularism is dominant. So that's what they're teaching now. If that's effectively the new secular religion, then who are the new priests of that religion? It's going to be the teachers, and at the university level, the professors who are espousing those ideas. So it's interesting because if you replace a universal religion like Islam, that the entire concept of deen is it's supposed to cover everything. If you replace something that's universalized like that with what we have instead today, what we have is a lot more compartmentalized today. And so people can essentially have multiple churches that are teaching them different aspects of the value system of this society. Although they overlap too, because it's funny, what do schools and universities tend to spend a ton of their money on? And devote a tremendous amount of space to? Yeah, things like sports. Right? Why? It's entertainment. Just, that's what sells. That's what gets kids to come there. So you see a lot of universities, in their literature, they put this really heavy emphasis on sports as a way to get students to come there. And even at the high school level, I don't even know how long, how many generations, maybe at least 3 generations, if not more, in our society now. The cool kids in school were pretty much always the athletic ones.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I mean, Nasr talks about this idea of compartmentalization of knowledge, and this is it sort of ties into last week's conversation with the idea of the holons, right, and like fitting into that hierarchy so that you're both related to what is below and what is above constantly. Well, with this approach, what you're doing is you're ripping stuff out,
right? You're not allowing it to be part of this larger structure. It has to be out by itself. So that's why when you study these subjects, or I mean, let's consider sports here to be a subject, each of these things is by itself. We don't really learn how these things connect, and part of that is we've been sort of without a theory of everything for a while now, especially in physics.
Interdisciplinary studies is considered some amazing, groundbreaking
Yes,
thing.
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, one of the classes I'm teaching now, it's like, oh, just it's called IDS for Benedictine University, and it's a cool idea, and I certainly like teaching it. But like that's a separate thing, and you're like, how is that a separate thing? Like, how do you, like, I'll take philosophy for example. How do you think you get to learn philosophy unless you're learning history and politics and economics and science all at once? Like, you're going to be worse off than Wikipedia, right? Like Wikipedia at least has links to other stuff. Like this is you've sort of memorized names of some people, some dates, and like their theories. But if you have no idea of the context when that's happening, how are you even supposed to interpret the thing you're reading? And now this sort of takes us to postmodernism, which says that there is no context, right? That there's nothing beyond the page itself. There's nothing outside the text, and then that causes all sorts of sort of problems there.
It's interesting you bring that up, because when I was reading this chapter on education, right, both of us are teachers and have been for a while now. I've also been learning quite a bit lately about, learning theories. And a lot of the more modern learning theories are related to these postmodern ideas. So let's take this one as an example here. I'm just going to read off of the page on this one here. So it's something called connectivism. Connectivism is a combination of theories developed on chaos, networks, and self-organization. Connectivism incorporates the following principles. Learning and knowledge rests in diversity of opinions. Learning is a process of connecting specialized nodes or information sources. Learning may reside in non-human appliances. Capacity to know more, so capacity to know more is more critical than what is currently known. Nurturing and maintaining connections is needed to facilitate continual learning. Ability to see connections between fields, ideas, and concepts is a core skill, and it continues from there. Now, some of those are just kind of intuitive, right? The ability to see connections, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's really hard to develop a theory of anything, much less a theory of learning, that gets nothing right, right? I mean, anyone who comes up with a theory must have observed some things and figured out, hey, these things are true, before they start basing their theory off it. Or at least these things are functional before they start basing a theory off it. But you see some things in here, like that learning and knowledge rests in diversity of opinions. Right? The idea that essentially comes out of this is the idea that we make our own meaning, or that we make our own facts about what reality is.
Right, there isn't a thing out there which knowledge gives you access to. You make up the thing out there through your opinion.
Yeah, and one of the consequences you get from this kind of thing is people saying that there is no such thing as objective truth or objective reality.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I have a different opinion than you, then obviously you can't be right, is sort of the idea. I mean, this especially comes up in these ethics classes early on, where people will say things like, oh, there is no objective and external rights or responsibilities because people have differing opinions on that. I'm like, yeah, I have differing opinions with Jeffrey Dahmer. It doesn't mean that he's potentially right. It just makes him very, very wrong. But the ability to take that statement and sort of unpack it
entirely missing, and part of that is because of the compartment of atomizing these ideas, because that's a word I can actually pronounce. And so you're never taught to take a statement and sort of go like, well, what does this look like if I take it into ethics? Right? What does this look like if I apply it outside of this field where I've been told about it? Right? You still carry the idea over, you just don't think about the difference in what it means. And so we take things like the way that people have different food preferences, and that means that there isn't there is no sort of better and worse cuisine. It's a matter of personal taste and preference.
Literally
and that,
taste.
Yes, and then we pretend that that has the same implications in stuff like ethics, in stuff like society. You're like, let me show you where that goes, and then again you have that recoil and horror kind of reaction.
There's an inability to distinguish between where preferences make sense and where preferences don't make sense.
Well,
or the areas where it's appropriate and the areas where it's not.
Well, what we've done is we've moved everything in terms of preference, and this is a postmodern problem, because they denied that there is truth. Not that I have access to it, although that too, but there is no such thing as truth. And therefore what you're left with is just a sort of subjective position. And it's the same kind of subjective position that tells you that, dark chocolate is bad. I don't mean that in any sort of like meaningful metric. What it means is I personally don't like dark chocolate. And that is now true. You can't see it, but I'm waving my hands in a funny way here. And the fact that we don't teach people critical thinking means that they'll take that idea and they'll keep spouting it. And even after you show them, it's like, oh, here's what it means, and they go like, well, I don't want that. You're like, okay. 2 weeks later, that's a default position. They keep falling back on that. And you're like, that still doesn't work. It didn't work 2 weeks ago. It still doesn't work today. Or if you think it does, demonstrate how. And there is no sort of critical thought that goes along with it. That might be one of those sort of, let's say, quantifiable problems of modern education because of the way that we approach it, because there is no sort of integration of knowledge into a hierarchy of knowledge and of learning. People have a really hard time of seeing what statement A has to do with statement B, because they happen to come from different fields. And so they hold these positions that are entirely incompatible, and unfortunately it leads to all sorts of problems. Just as a last thing, because we're just about out of time, I was listening to the mayor of Tampa, Florida, talk about they were going to sort of be redoing downtown Tampa, and he's like, and we need to focus on two things. One, we need to sort of update the whole thing and make it wonderful and new and all the rest of that, and we need to make sure that it has plenty of affordable housing. And I'm like, those two things are diametrically opposed to one another, because if you gentrify the neighborhood, right, like if you build up all new stuff, that's going to attract businesses and all sorts of things like that, and that is going to drive demand up, and when demand goes up, so do the prices. So unless you're pushing for the city to buy out a bunch of these apartments and then rent them at like way under the appropriate price, those two things will never ever come together, ever. If you're going to succeed at one, you inherently fail at the other. But the person saying this, and certainly none of the people hearing it, go like, hold on a second.
Well, I mean, when you hear something like that, you can't wonder anymore why our movies portray the government as being inept. right? Because they say things that are obviously contradictory. The biggest example of that is how politicians always want to both lower taxes and increase spending. And you can't do both. Not if you want to, avoid going into massive debt that's going to eventually crush your economy.
Well, I would like to point out that that's exactly what we've been doing.
That's what we're doing.
And China is there to go like, woohoo!
Yeah.
We're buying up all the debt.
Well, I know we're running out of time here, but the single biggest thing that we're accomplishing through that is mortgaging the future, because the single biggest creditor of our national debt is kind of ourselves. It's the Social Security Trust Fund. And so there's not some bank account somewhere where there's hundreds of billions of dollars in Social Security money just kind of sitting there, and money gets taken out of it, money gets put into it, that kind of thing. No, basically the government's been writing a series of IOUs for decades now, basically taking that Social Security money, because we've had a surplus pretty consistently throughout its history, and taking that surplus and putting it into other stuff and then writing IOUs. Well, how are you going to repay those is essentially the problem.
We are going to apologize to a bunch of old people and then give them nothing.
Yeah.
Alright, so on that high note, we are going to end this session because we got to go teach. Thank you all for listening. If you got questions or comments, leave them in the comments or email us, and we'll see you next week.